Welcome to the Autonomic Homeostasis Activation Podcast. I'm Tom Powles.
And I'm Ruth Lorensson. We'll be unpacking what it looks like to activate your brain to holistically manage stress and trauma to facilitate homeostasis.
Being free to experience wellness in body, mind, and spirit.
Thank you for joining us. Let's get this conversation started.
We're so excited today to have Scott Turner in the house again, if you can call Google Meet a house, but we are recording our second part of this really interesting conversation with Scott. We're talking about purpose and desire and homeostasis. And so, Tom, I'm going to throw it over to you because I know you've got some really insightful questions that are really going to lead this next part of this episode. So do you want to kick us off?
Oh, yes, please. Scott, I'm going to pick your brain. So,
okay, thank you.
Last time in the prior episode, we were talking about we're not mechanisms. We are, you can drop oil in and have beneficial effects, but also those other effects that, we weren't looking for in this mechanism because it is so complex. And we are living organisms, holistic, and we exist with purpose. And we were talking about that. And my thoughts since then, and would love to hear your thoughts on this, regarding purposefulness in a living being, Walter Cannon said with regard to homeostasis, the living being is stable. It must be so in order not to be destroyed, dissolved, or disintegrated by the colossal forces, often adverse, which surround it. He further elaborated that, in a sense, it is stable because it is modifiable. The slight instability is the necessary condition for the true stability of the organism. So when it comes to stability, we humans are all about wanting it, but often create so much instability. That's the difference between wellness and a lack of wellness. And you wrote in your book, the challenge of niche construction theory in modern Darwinism is serious and, in my view, compelling. Where the challenge is most strenuous, however, is how niche construction theory admits the phenomenon of agency back into evolutionary thought. And with agency comes homeostasis, intentionality, and purpose. So this agency of organisms, this agency that we have as organisms to shape and be shaped by environments, and how this impacts homeostasis, intentionality, and purposefulness. And like busy little beavers, we humans are both shaping and shaped by our environments. Microenvironments like our minds and bodies, family and friend networks, as well as macro environments like our places of work and play, as well as communities and the nations and the earth itself in which we live. And like the busy little beavers, we purposefully go about this interaction for good or ill. And we'd love your thoughts on how purposeful homeostasis can inform our efforts. That's a lot, I know, but...
Okay. Well, there are a lot of questions in there. Maybe we could start with just an encapsulation of what niche construction theory is, because that's, maybe your listeners might not be aware of what it is. Just to encapsulate the essence of it, when we speak of adaptation, and Walter Cannon did speak about this in terms of changeability to circumstances and those kinds of things, this usually translates into the organism adapting to the environment, and that's the conventional way we think about adaptation. It gets cold, the hairs rise up on across the body, or the feathers fluff up on a bird, and so forth, and so that's the bird adapting to colder conditions. The colder conditions are imposed, and of course the opposite happens when conditions warm up. Birds molt their feathers and all these other kinds of things. So that conceives as adaptation as being one way the organism adapts to the environment. Where niche construction theory comes in is it adds an additional wrinkle to that, in that you're now talking about organisms adapting the environment to themselves. And so the very simple example is if we want to live in an environment that is colder than our own physiology can adapt to, then we just adapt the environment. We build shelters, we go hunt animals for their skins and all these other, to provide insulation and all these other kinds of things. So the really radical idea behind niche construction theory is that not only do organisms adapt to environments, but also organisms adapt environments to themselves. And this is a challenge to not only how we think about physiology of organisms, but it's also a challenge to how we think evolution works. And we can get into that a little bit later if you like. Now, that's niche construction theory. At the heart of niche construction theory is a concept that actually is kind of troublesome, not only to organismal biology, including medicine, but also ecology, evolutionary biology, and so forth. And that's in this word adaptation, and adaptation is kind of a troubled concept in not only in modern physiology, modern medicine, but also in evolutionary thought. I think we mentioned last week, I spoke about the cybernetic model of adaptation, so that's the common way that we think about homeostasis of living organisms, and the classic example is, all right, so we have a regulated body temperature, and therefore we have a thermostat inside our bodies that works just like the thermostat does on the walls of our own houses. And so the steadiness of the internal environment there is a result of a machine that regulates that temperature. It senses the temperature. It puts out signals to open windows or turn on the heater or all those kinds of things. But that's not really the way that adaptation works, and it's not really a very good way to think about adaptation when we talk about niche construction theory. So as I said, if we feel cold, that's a subjective feeling. We do things to modify the environment so that we don't feel cold anymore. And in that case, it's a very conscious thing. But the important word there is want. I feel cold, therefore I want to be warm. And this is where agency comes in. In the niche construction world, organisms are not machines; they are actual agents that act purposefully. And when I talk anyway to my fellow evolutionists, they say, okay, well, this word want is okay. It's a convenient shorthand. It's a convenient metaphor for what's really going on down there, which is the operation of a machine. But I think that's denial. When you talk about wanting, that's a very real phenomenon. There's no apparent wanting. There's no apparent purposefulness, which is the way that which is the fallback position for a strictly mechanistic approach to biology. Wanting and desire and purpose is actually real, and the big challenge for scientists across the board is to figure out some kind of rational understanding of where this purposefulness and intentionality comes from. And we're sort of making progress there, but there's still this hurdle that if you're going to be a scientist, you must be mechanistic. If you're going to introduce these kind of nebulous concepts like wanting and purpose or desire, then you're disqualified from being a scientist. And I think that's a major shortcoming of most modern biology, most modern thinking about evolutionism, and so forth. And the key concept that we don't really have a handle on is this concept of adaptation. What is it? How does it work? how does homeostasis fit into it? And I think I mentioned last time that homeostasis is, in my opinion, probably the most misunderstood and trivialized concept in modern biology. We seem to have lost your sound, Tom.
Oh, I turned my microphone off because I was listening to you.
There we are.
So this idea of purposefully pursuing well-being is in our very nature. And that exists. So
not just in our nature, but the nature of every living thing.
Yes. And our integration into that, our interaction with that, and pursuing that is a function of homeostasis. But we as human beings so often purposefully pursue things that are not in our well-being. And that strikes me as a strange anomaly for us as humans as opposed to those termites, etc. So your thoughts on that?
You phrase it correctly that this striving derives from homeostasis. This ties into what I mentioned last time, which is that, the cybernetic metaphor looks at homeostasis as the outcome of a mechanism. Whereas if you delve into Claude Bernard's own writings on it, he said that no, the mechanism derives from the homeostasis, that it's actually just the opposite. And so that's a mode of thinking that's very hard for people to get their heads around. And this is one of the reasons why I have argued that homeostasis is a trivialized and misunderstood concept. All right. And so what's at the heart of homeostasis? Well, or how do these mechanisms actually come about from homeostasis? And I think I mentioned last time that if you look at the philosophical strains of modern scientific thought, you have an atomistic thing, which the cybernetic metaphor ties into very closely. But you also have two purpose-driven or purposeful philosophies. And of course, that's Plato versus Aristotle. And Aristotle is most relevant here. He argued that there's some internal self-knowledge of what something is supposed to be. That's a very purposeful kind of a thing, and everything derives from that purpose. And so, when you have a bird where it gets cold and he starts to grow insulating plumage, the bird loaded up with the insulating plumage is a different looking bird from the bird in the summer, but they're still birds, A sparrow is still a sparrow, whether it's cold or not. And this struck Aristotle as indicating some internal self-knowledge of what a sparrow is supposed to be, if you will. And the form of the sparrow might change depending upon conditions. That's the adaptation at work. But it's still a sparrow. That is, there's still this core self-knowledge of what it is supposed to be. So that's a crucial concept, this notion, what Aristotle called bios, to actually having a full understanding of what homeostasis is. And of course, as I said, this is totally contrary to the whole mechanistic approach to life. You can believe in purposefulness, but you can still acknowledge that the purposefulness operates in a physical and chemical world. There's a chemical and physical basis for this. Living things can't violate the laws of thermodynamics. That's just not possible. But nevertheless, you can still have this purposefulness that operates in a physical and chemical realm, but what's in charge? Is it the chemical and physics, or is it the actual striving, if you will, of the sparrow to be a sparrow and to do whatever it takes to modify its environment, both internally and externally, in order to sustain itself as a sparrow?
Yeah,
That's
and
cool.
our series is on wellness and the fundamentals of wellness. And just to remind our listeners, wellness is that state of being in good health, especially as a consciously pursued goal, encompassing well-being, physical, mental, emotional, social, spiritual, with the aim to optimize overall quality of life. And that's an adaptive process. That is a purposefully adaptive process. And so what we've been talking about may seem like this esoteric niche construction theory, but it has very real implications for us as human beings and organisms living in the environment. And I'm going to throw it over to you, Ruth, for just a moment from the perspective of you've been listening to these two again, talking about the theories and everything, from your perspective is just maybe even hearing about niche construction theory for the first time and listening to what Scott was sharing. What thoughts, what questions were you wondering about?
Yeah, thanks, Tom. I think, what I'm hearing is that it's both and, there's something that is inherent in us that will, like the temperature gauge, that there's something in our bodies that will adjust, but actually it won't put a coat on in layman's terms. And so, what I'm hearing is to be healthy humans that, I guess embrace our level of well-being, we need both. We need to understand that both of these things are at play in our lives. And so I think what I was really struck by is this word want that Scott mentioned. And I think that actually, Tom and Scott, I think that's such a really important word in wellness. When we think about our lives, like to want to be well, to want to adjust, that's not just a default of, I think sometimes, I guess what I'm saying is a lot of the time humans can think things are just happening at them. But there is this kind of, that word agency, I mean, it's a really cool, loaded word if we grasp hold of it, that we actually do have agency, as well as this, as well as an internal thing that will just happen because we're, of our body's makeup, I guess. So, I guess I want to focus on that want, that agency. What does that look like? What stops that? What is there anything that, Scott, you've seen in nature that would stop that, or is nature just like, no, they want it, they understand it, and how, I guess, why, in terms of the human condition, why do we struggle so much with agency and want? I know I'm falling into philosophy here, but I'm throwing it back over to you. You asked me, Tom, so I'm sharing my questions. Any thoughts from either of you?
Yeah. As I mentioned, this whole concept of wanting and striving is a very problematic one for most modern medicine and also most modern biology. And that is a difficult concept to get your head around. The connection to niche construction, or I should say the connection to niche construction is, where does that agency come in, and at what levels does the agency come in? And when you talk about the human body, or any animal body for that matter, and we can actually extend it to ecosystems or what have you, is that we are an ecological community, or an ecosystem, if you will. And of course, the big thing now is that our ecosystem inside our body is more than just the cells that have descended from the fertilized egg that has given rise to all of us. There's bacteria and microbiomes that live in various surfaces of the body, and so forth. So we really are an ecosystem, and each cell within our body exists in a niche for example, to use that ecological term. And these cells create environments in which they live. So, for example, in the body, animal body, one of the fundamental aspects of the organization of cells is for individual cells to form into these sheet-like communities that are called epithelia. And if you look at the organization of the body, all of these epithelia fold up into various kinds of combinations and whatnot that make organs. Now, in each case, you have at all levels, you have striving agents at work, but the striving may differ from one level of organization to another. So, when a group of cells organizes into an epithelium, they're really taking the environment and they're dividing it into two. They're dividing it into the environment where the cells live, and they're dividing it into an external environment, if you will. And it doesn't stop there. Groups of epithelia can form environments themselves that each of those things are organizing to sustain. I don't want to get too deep into the weeds here, but the agency operates at many different levels, many different scales, and many different levels of organization. And it's all intentional agents creating environments. And they create environments by building an interface between one environment and another. And at the heart of that is that interface is the cell has knowledge, or the epithelium has knowledge of what's going on one side of the boundary, and then it has an internal mechanism to respond to that change in the external environment, and enables. This is where niche construction comes in. It enables the manipulation of that external environment to serve the cell's needs. And like I said, it's a little bit of a complicated thing, but the point is that these purposeful agents, they operate at many different scales. The cell is the most fundamental one. The epithelium is the next one, all the way up to the organs and organ systems and skin and so forth. And it doesn't stop there. We as organisms can act as agents to modify the environment outside our skins, for example. And all of that depends upon having an exchange of information at all these different levels, right? I call these things, that no matter what scale, adaptive interfaces. That you have an interface that divides environments. You have an ability to assess what's going on one side of the environment, outside in quotes, because a lot of external environments to cells are actually internal to our own bodies, you know that. And then there are mechanisms for manipulating flows of matter and energy to create new environments, to adapt environments to the physiological needs of the cells. And that's a very, very difficult thing to get your head around, right? And there's a metaphor that came from the 18th century when physicians were starting to think about this. I think I might have mentioned it in our last conversation, this concept of the many little lives, and that if you look at the state of the organism, it's as a result of this endless conversation, interaction, mutual accommodation, if you will, of all the many little lives to one another. The really complicated thing is those many little lives can be cells, they can be epithelia, they can be organs, they can be all these other kinds of things. And so if you're talking about wellness versus illness, the whole Hippocratic idea that good health is the result of a balance between opposing forces, okay, that's fine. But it's missing this notion that homeostasis actually comes from all these conversations and modifications of environments and so forth that go on. And our own feeling of wellness or ill health, that's kind of an epiphenomenon of all those conversations going on. If we feel cold, right, we are consciously aware of being cold because we're constructing this feeling, if you will, out of all the intentional conversations among the many little lives of the body. And when we feel ill health, we feel the same thing, right? We feel out of sorts and so forth. And part of that is we want to get better. We don't like feeling badly. When our body is telling us we're feeling badly, we don't want that state anymore. And so we'll try to basically change what's going on. And what that means really is that when you're of ill health, there's something going on with the conversations of the many little lives, right? And you can come in, and we said, we used a metaphor, you can drip oil into the thing with pharmaceuticals and maybe it will come better and so forth, and you'll feel better, all right? That's fine. But is that really treating what's going on in the body? And we had some conversations about cancer, for example, when Tom came up to my place here, and we went out to a lovely lunch. Thank you, Tom, for that. It was terrific, great conversation. And if you look at cancer, for example, it's not that that the conversations among the many little lives have changed. It's that you have a group of cells that decide to have their own conversation, and they, to try to manipulate the body to be able to enable them to dominate the conversation. And so when you have a tumor, for example, growing, one of the first things it does is it induces vascularization of the tumor, so the body can supply all the nice nutrients and oxygen and whatnot that the tumor needs to grow. So that's basically just a group of cells that have taken it upon themselves to shout louder, right? And a tumor is as purposeful a part of the body as is everything else. It wants to grow. It does this. It has the means to be able to dominate the conversation. And so if you want to restore someone to ill health, restore them to good health, then somehow you have to get in there and you have to change that conversation. Take it out with surgically or treat it with some kind of chemical so that it's no longer dominating the conversation. And the purposefulness of the tumor actually goes beyond that. I know that there's one school of therapy that says, well, if we can get the immune system to attack the tumor, then that's the magic bullet that you need to be able to get those tumors to die. But oddly enough, it's the immune system that can actually facilitate the metastasis of a tumor, for example. And so, and it's because the conversations have changed as the result of the presence of that tumor. So if you go beyond vascularization of the tumor, for example, tumors can actually enlist the immune system to actually take colonists, if you will, and send them to other tissues. And that's not something that if we're mechanistically inclined, we're going to wrap our heads around. It's a very radical idea, and so, when you are talking about homeostasis, this Hippocratic idea that there's this natural balance that's going on there, that if we just restore, we'll be fine. What's really going on is you have all these conversations going on among the agents of the body, and when they are all harmoniously negotiating, come to a nice mutual accommodation, then you have a subjective feeling of wellness. You have a subjective feeling of illness when something has gone wrong with those conversations. And honestly, I don't think we have a good feeling for how we get in there and manipulate those conversations. I can only speak in terms of ecology and whatnot. I can't speak to it in terms of medicine or wellness or therapies or those kinds of things. But the hypothesis is that the key to going from ill health to wellness is to somehow get in and manipulate the conversations that are going on in the ill body, for example. Because in the ill body, all the cells are homeostatic, right? They're all manipulating the environment to their own ends. They're constructing environments that are adaptive for them. And the conversations have gotten a little bit out of whack. One group of cells is dominating the conversation where previously it hadn't.
And if we just extend that into the human and humans as organisms, there is such a hubris, an excessive pride and confidence that we have in our own minds to manipulate all that. But what we so often do is wind up, because we perceive something as beneficial and we pursue it, when in reality and impact it's detrimental, we're functionally cancers in our own environments, and then we're promoting our own demise because we're compromising something that would naturally go toward those many little lives naturally functioning together. But in our individual hubris or a collective hubris of like-minded, this is a great idea, except no, it's not. Don't do that. And I think that to know that that is inherent in our own nature, down to a cellular level, and that just to step away from the hubris of look at how smart we can be and we can manipulate the machine, to we are a part of an organism, and we are an organism within the organisms, and we can pursue wellness, and it's in our very nature to pursue wellness. I just love that. That is so hopeful to me.
Yeah, I just want to chip in here, and it just makes me think, I'm a leader, Scott. I'm not in any of your spaces at all, but I've spent my, decades facilitating conversations, and you always have that one person or maybe two in the group that dominate and take over the conversation. And I think part of leadership is to know how to facilitate a conversation and know how to balance the room, reading the room kind of, and then making sure you don't shut that person down, but you kind of are very aware that person's too loud and other people aren't necessarily speaking. So it just really, as you were speaking about this kind of conversation, I think it's such a brilliant way of looking at even ill health, in our bodies, because we see it as something I was listening, a friend of mine at the moment is going through a cancer diagnosis, and I think some of the way we even think about cancer is like, well, we've got to kill it, we've got to get it out, and actually it is part of us and it's part of a conversation. But I just wondered, I think it just made me think of this idea of, actually, is wellness facilitating healthy conversation, and how do we facilitate, make sure that there aren't the dominant speakers, and then there are, or maybe there's part of us that needs to have more volume. I'm not sure what you think about that.
Well, this is part of the problem, I think, with homeostasis. We tend to think of illness as a disruption of homeostasis, but this is the funny thing. It's all homeostatic. A tumor is as much driven by homeostasis, its self knowledge and striving of what the tumor is supposed to be, and it goes all the way up to conscious awareness. Someone who is dominating the conversation, they're dominating it because it feels good to them, and we tend to react badly against that, sometimes appropriately, sometimes inappropriately, I think, because it's not making us feel good, and therefore we want to shape the conversation that's going on there. But this forces us to rethink the whole notion of just what derangement is. Is it a failure of homeostasis, or is it homeostasis operating just as it should be? And I think probably the ultimate kind of abnormal homeostasis, if you will. To me, the most compelling metaphor is addiction, and of course the addictive state, it looks very bad to us, and it usually is, obviously, but to the addicted person, it's the perfectly rational thing to do. It makes them feel good, and that's why they strive to do that, and it feels good to them when it's objectively bad, because you've actually changed the conversation within the pleasure reward system of the brain in such a way that the normal conversation doesn't exist anymore. And you can explain that in terms of sensitivity of dopamine receptors and all these other kinds of things, and then drip the oil in to help make it go away. But addiction is very, very persistent because these conversations have changed. They've changed in a way that actually is homeostatic to the addict himself or herself. And somehow to wean someone off of their addiction, you have to change the way that your brain is conversing within itself. And sometimes it works pretty well, and others it doesn't. As you know, in the whole field of addiction, there's a lot of controversy about what actually works and what doesn't. This to me is the most difficult thing about this. And actually gives me the greatest doubts about what this whole thing is. How do you get a handle on what these conversations are? Is it such a general idea that it explains everything and therefore explains nothing? I don't know. I haven't got to that point yet. But or do we come up with a way that we can rationally talk about the conversations that are going on among the many little lives, and therapies and treatments that can actually intervene and change those conversations?
Yep. And
does that make any sense?
Oh, absolutely. And my experience as a psychotherapist, as a helping professional, as a wellness coach, is to help guide that person into beneficial conversations, whether it's with themselves, with others, with their own bodies. And so that the end result doesn't simply gratify and is perceived as wellness because I like this and it feels good, when that's not actually wellness at all. And we may be detrimentally contributing to our own illness simply because we're pursuing something that makes us feel good.
Yeah, addiction is the classic example of that.
And that is not in harmony with our very natures, I think. And when we won't persist long if we allow those conversations to dominate. Let's put it that way. And ultimately, we're going to feel pretty bad about what our conversations among our many little lives have guided us to. And as I say, to me, addiction is the classic metaphor or the classic exemplar of how homeostasis and changing the conversations between all the many little lives can result in ill health. It feels great, but it's still very bad for us. Brilliant. So thank you so much, Scott. Thank you for Ruth and your contributions. Let's all pursue beneficial conversations at so many micro and macro levels so that we all thrive.
You've been listening to the Autonomic Homeostasis Activation Podcast. Join us next time as we continue in our conversations with Tom.
If you're interested in pursuing your own wellness journey, please check out our website, autonomichealing.org.
You can also reach out to Tom at innerworkings.org.